I originally came to know Isidore Ragoutsos, it was in the context of my being a chair of a department of pathology and lab medicine, where we're in the business of dealing with large amounts of diagnostic data. At a time when data was becoming a commodity, data interpretation was going to be king. And we would have to bring pathology into that world. And in fact, running a very large research operation, my pitch was that probably 1 out of every 3 recruits to the faculty ultimately would be someone who never even touched a test tube, but was simply dealing with data and looking for patterns in data and coming to generating hypotheses out of it. And coming across Isidore Ragoutsos was fit right into that, because here was somebody who can deal with data, but also was approaching it in incredibly creative kinds of ways, because he's what I call a non-linear thinker. He's able to sort of look at data, see what the data is saying, but then make leaps of interpretation that don't necessarily, go through the conventional path. Well, we're going into an age where it's probably going to be less expensive to sequence the entire genome of that individual. Given that data, that's the commoditization part of data, but what do you do with that? When you have billions of letters in an alphabet soup, where's the interpretation? What does it mean for the patient? And how do you tie that to treating disease and preventing disease in the patient? And that's the incredible excitement of where the field is going now. The sort of the hot topic in the futurist look at where medicine heads talks about personalization of medicine. And the simplest way of thinking about it is someone has a certain cancer that looks a certain way under a microscope, and it's given a diagnosis based on what it looks like under the microscope. The first generation of personalization said, well, let's look at the molecules, the expressed genes inside the tumor cell, and let's subdivide all the cancers that look the same under the microscope into different groupings. Well, that's one level of personalization, but if you look at 10 or 20 years from now, there's what I would call the personalizing of personalized medicine, because what we're really headed to is where no 2 individuals are the same. So even if a number of their standard molecular markers are the same and they look the same under the microscope, they will vary between those 2 individuals. And not only that, the cancer is occurring in a different person who has an entirely different physiologic makeup, and we'll be able to get a fingerprint of that. The exciting thing about what Isidore Ragoutsos has been doing is he's been documenting that level of individualization that's going on, because his work is showing that there are fundamental differences in the expressed genome based on race, based on sex, based on geographic origin, and all sorts of other parameters. The interesting thing out of all of this is it's making things a lot more complex, because the number of different genetic elements, as one example, is growing tremendously. But at the same time, that complexity will be able to tunnel through that complexity through the kind of data sciences that he's doing to ultimately individualize what we're doing for the patient. Every patient is their own unique individual with respect to disease processes. There's another interesting thing that's emerging, which is typically we talk about treatment of disease and prevention of disease. but there's another factor that's coming into play. There's another concept that's coming into play, and that's preemption of disease, where we look at an individual's molecular makeup, which includes their genetic makeup at a moment in time, and that we take that in the context of all the other parameters that describe that patient in where they live and who they are, and decide what they are, what diseases they themselves are likely to get. So typically prevention has been, well, let's prevent heart disease. And so everybody gets the same recommendation of what prevention is. But when you start individualizing prevention and say, well, there are certain things that you have a certain statistical chance, certain diseases you have a statistical chance of getting in this kind of way, you can start talking about an entirely exciting new possibility, which is preemption of disease. And again, the detailed kinds of molecular analyses and discoveries that are coming out of the Computational Medicine Center here are laying the groundwork for that frontier area of therapeutics. Many times you can't explain the data, right? But that doesn't mean you discount it or discard it. And I think that's the power of a really good scientist. Well, they'll say, okay, well, these are the observations, these are the data points, and at this moment in time, we don't have the hypotheses to answer it, but you have it sort of stored away. And you resist the inclination of discarding it and forgetting about it. When you use data in the way that Isidore talks about it, it's really respecting that data and not feeling compelled to have a clear hypothesis to explain it on day one. We talk a lot here at Jefferson about crossing disciplines, and there are really two ways you can cross disciplines. For instance, computational sciences and biomedicine as an example. One of them is to bring experts from those two fields together, and that takes you a certain distance. But ultimately, you've got to have people who, in a single individual, can start to assimilate some of the fundamental concepts that underlie those two disciplines. And that's much harder to do. How do you cultivate those sorts of individuals? I'd argue that Isidore Ragoutsos is one of those types of individuals. If you look at his training, he started as a computer scientist, but then over the last 15 or 20 years, his publications have been in the biomedicine literature. And he's conversant in both those areas, but yet he then complements that by bringing together a team that has experts in both of those areas. So I think it's an interesting case study in how we cross disciplines. And when we talk about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, that's what we have to be thinking about. And this is front and center for people like myself who are a provost of a university, a dean of a medical school, because when we say we want to train the people who can function in cross-disciplinary type ways, what does that actually mean? How do we cultivate that capability in students as we train them? And so our investment in computational biology and computational medicine is really driven by an excitement, because we have this implicit and intuitive sense that this is where the future is going. Intuitive even for somebody who is not, conversant in computer sciences per se, but a clear understanding that this is where things are going, and you need somebody who's going to leapfrog. And so for us, in no small part, Computational Medicine Center is sort of a bet in an unknown future and a leapfrogging into that future, knowing that some of the things will dead end, but also fairly confident that, given sort of the genius that, one is investing in, that some really exciting discoveries will be coming out of it.